Hello everyone, welcome to KALAM's answer writing session for the day. So today I've taken up a question on climate change and I'll read out the question for you all. But before I do that, let's talk about certain prerequisites that are required when you address a question on ecology, conservation, climate change and so on. One important thing is to talk about the international reports that are there. The first thing is the usage of IPCC, International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and so on. So this has released certain reports on climate change and how much we have to curtail our temperature rise. It used to say that we have to curtail our temperature rise within 2 degrees centigrade, and now it is saying 1.5 degrees centigrade and so on. So that is what this report is talking about. And in addition to this, you have to talk about several conventions and so on which are related to climate change. If you talk about ozone layer, talk about Montreal Protocol. If you talk about and now you can talk about Kigali Agreement also. And in addition to this, if you talk about global greenhouse gas emissions, you could talk about Kyoto Protocol. And then you have COP25, which is most recent. And where was this held in? By the way, it was held in Madrid. So this is all the content that you can put in when you handle a question on ecology, environment and climate change. So now that we have the prerequisites out of the way, I'll read out the question for you all, after which I'll convert the answer the question into the usual introduction, body and conclusion format, which we do. So I'll read out the question. To stop the firing of Earth, what actually needed is real zero emissions rather than manipulated net zero emissions. Discuss the statement in the wake of climate change. So he's asking you to discuss about this particular statement in the wake of climate change. You have to talk whatever you talk in the context of the changing climate, and in addition to this, you have to talk about the steps. So I have realized that I definitely have to talk about the ways and measures to handle the issue, the ways and measures to handle the issue of climate change as such. And in addition to this, I have to start with the introduction of how real zero emissions is the big deal and not the net zero emissions. So I have to talk about real zero emissions versus net zero emissions, and I have to defend what? I have to defend real zero emissions. So these are the two things that are going to be the important subheadings in my answer. Okay, and in addition to this, is there anything else that we can write? We could probably talk about the impact of having a real zero emission ka scenario and so on. So we will see that when we look at the sample answer. But before I do that, let's take a moment in understanding what the difference is between real zero emissions and the net zero emissions. So why did this come up in recent times? By the way, in the Davos summit, Greta Thunberg has talked about the importance of moving towards real zero emissions instead of net zero emission. Yeah, net zero emissions mein what people are doing is the developed countries are continuing their emissions, but whatever targets they were supposed to achieve in terms of carbon reduction, they are outsourcing it to the into the other countries. So they continue, so the developed countries are continuing the production, but what they're doing is whatever afforestation they are supposed to do, they are doing it in Africa, and then they are doing it through joint implementation. They are doing it to carbon offsetting and trading and so on. So that is basically a neat and smart way of doing it, but it is not achieving the purpose of controlling climate change, because to control climate change you have to put in strong efforts. You have to go for greenhouse gas control technology. You have to move away from coal and towards renewable energy and so on. So instead of taking up these honest measures, these countries are basically sidestepping the real measures and moving towards the concept of net zero emissions by shifting the burden to the other countries, to the emerging countries. They're saying the emerging countries may we will set up new plants which are more energy efficient, so that way we will be able to save, we will be able to cut down emissions in an overall sense. So that is what they are trying to tell. But the problem is, are they cutting down emissions in their own countries? Are they moving towards more energy efficient technologies? Are they moving from coal to renewable energy? These questions are not answered by the developed countries, because everybody knows what the truth is. They are basically not cutting down on their emissions. They are trying to purchase these carbon cuts through the different mechanisms of Kyoto Protocol and so on, and they are shifting the burden to the developing countries. Okay, and while they are shifting the burden to developing countries, they are not providing developing countries with enough resources to take care afforestation programs or carbon efficient technologies and so on. So, in this context, what Greta Thunberg has said in the Davos meet is that we should move from net zero emissions, which is basically a false sense of pride. Instead of doing that, we have to go for real zero emissions, in which every country, be it a developed country or a developing country, participates in the common project of cutting down emissions. And when this happens, we will be able to curtail the temperature rise, we will be able to curtail the sea level rise, we will also be able to improve the biodiversity all over the world, and especially in the biodiversity hotspots, be it on the land or in the ocean. By the way, in the ocean, what do you call the hotspots? If I remember right, they are called the hope spots. This is really important, for this could be handy in prelims. I want you all to keep that in mind. So I want you all to identify the hope spots and put them in the comment section, so the other people would be able to gain that knowledge out of you. Let's share knowledge as much as possible. So I have introduced the answer. And how do I introduce the answer? I could introduce the answer by a fact. I give out a report and that start saying that the climate change is a reality, the temperature is rising by so and so much, and we have had so many hot years in the last few decades, and it's only because of climate change, so we have to talk about real zero emissions. That is one way of introducing things. The second way of introducing things is to describe what real zero versus net zero emission is. This approach, while handy, is really difficult because abhi koi consensus nahi hai. Some people are talking about net zero emissions. There is evolution of this term called real zero emissions, but there is no strict delineation between these two things. So let's not take a risk. We will start with the fact on climate change, because that is not a risky place. We know lots of facts about climate change. IPCC report has said that climate change is a reality. It is increasing sea level rise and so on. We have to curtail the temperature within 2 degrees centigrade and so on. So this is an easy fact that we can talk about. But if you want to describe real emission and real zero emission and net zero emission, you have to be really rich in terms of your readings, and that is not possible because before mains there are lots of topics you are supposed to revise. Climate change, environment and conservation is basically just one topic. You also have a lot of things to read about in your in the same paper. You have economics, you have disaster management, security and so on. So is types are specific approach pe mat jao. Start with fact because it is easy to start with. So we've evolved the introduction, body and conclusion format for the answer. Now we will move forward and evaluate the sample answer and try to pick hole in that particular answer. So the answer starts out with an introduction through IPCC report. It's better if you if you mention the full name of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and so on. The answer says that time and again this report has pointed out how carbon emissions have been driving climate change. This is a good way of starting his introduction, but it would have been nicer if he talked about some figure, some 2 degrees centigrade ka figure and so on. Like in the last decade you have the highest number of hottest years and so on. So all these kinds of figures, numbers could have been put in the introduction. That would have made the introduction much richer, but this is also good. Then he is moving forward and distinguishing between net zero and real zero emissions. This is a smart approach. I'll tell you all right. If you were to describe this, if you all were to describe what you'll have to describe properly net zero emissions and smart zero emissions, net zero emissions and real zero emissions, you would have faced some problems. Instead of that, net zero emissions and real zero emissions karke you are distinguishing between the two using this subheadings, using this little diagram and writing down the characteristics. Net zero is not as good as real zero is what you are supposed to establish. Let's see what he does. He says moving to climate friendly technology in real zero emissions, R&D on carbon sequestration, taking real charge of emission reductions, especially by developed countries, right? So what is net zero emissions? Net zero emissions is not as honest as real zero emissions, is what the question is trying to establish in a manner of speaking. So Paris Agreement, COP25, Madrid, these are basically the conferences in which this concept of net zero emission has emerged. So he has mentioned them. This has densified the answer because he has mentioned the facts. And then there is minimal decrease in emission because net zero emissions has had lofty ideals, but it is not being implemented because of poor monitoring and so on. And then offsetting emissions by planting trees elsewhere, shifting the burden to poor countries, not making many changes in developed countries. Developed countries do not make much changes themselves. So overall, even if there are energy efficient technologies coming up in developing countries, eventually it is going to hurt us, no? Because the developed countries are not really moving towards energy efficient technology. They are not cutting down on their carbon emissions. They are purchasing carbon emissions simply because they are rich. But are they taking enough measures to handle the climate change? No. So that is what you are supposed to establish when you write about net zero and real zero emissions. Instead of doing this diagram, which looks a little complicated, you could have also gone for a tabular format. Net zero, real zero emission. And why is this important? Why do I have to talk about net zero and real zero emissions? People have been sending me answers about the previous questions that we have discussed. The people are sending me answers based on what they have been reading. If you're answering a question on governor, you're not supposed to write what are the powers of the governor, and is it right to have positives of having governors as a post, negatives of having governors as a post. Nay, this is not what has been asked by the asked by the question. Please understand, I want you all to sit down and think about it. If you were the examiner, would you want to see the side headings? You want to see the answers, see the points in such a way they are tailor made to the question that has been asked, no? You have to customize your points to the need of the question, right? And in order to do that, you have to evolve right subheadings. You have to use each and every word in the question so that the examiner thinks that you are close by to the question. Yahan se if you create your own subheadings which are remotely relevant to the question, it is going to create trouble, is what is my humble submission to you all. So he has distinguished between emissions, net zero and real zero. This is a good value addition. Now he is moving towards need for real zero emissions. This ensures that the burden of emission reduction is borne by all countries. You should have mentioned CBDR here. CBDR is nothing but common but differentiated responsibilities, and then it leads to faster reduction in erratic climate events: El Nino, La Nina, cloudbursts, cyclones, bushfires, and so on. Bushfires, we have them recently in Australia. El Nino, La Nina, and so happens quite often. It happens periodically. Cloudburst, though, we had in Uttarakhand. Cyclone, though, we have them in the eastern coast of India. In fact, 75% of the cyclones in India happen in eastern coast. So what I'm trying to establish basically through all these fact points is that we have been facing all of these things. India has been facing all of these things. It may not be useful for this answer as such, but I want you all to know the scourge or the problem of climate change and how ubiquitous and how widespread it is. It's not just a problem of emerging countries or just the developed countries. It is a problem of everybody. That is why this little girl who is smaller than all of us, this little Greta Thunberg, has been shouting on the top of our voice in big meets like Davos and so on. So we should at least be aware of these things. That is what I feel. Now we will move forward. We will look at the points. If developed countries show sincerity, what happens is the emerging countries will have faith. Once they have faith, they will also follow the lead. And then the real zero emissions will not just decrease the carbon emissions, but they will also improve the crop yields, preserve wildlife, decrease sea level rise, and so on. So these are important points. I want you all to know how he has mentioned A, B, C, 3 points in a single point. In order to increase the visibility of this, he could have written by A, B, C. So basically what I want you to understand, this whole process of answer writing is being able to sell your answer to the examiner, and you will be able to do it really well when you understand the ways in which you can make your answer visible. Isme kya hota hai, it's all in a single line. I'll probably read the first part, the second part, and then I'll leave this out. Instead of doing this, if you give me these side headings with 3 or 4 words in each side heading, I'm going to read it all because it is more visible. So these little tricks and tips I want you all to understand. While net zero emissions focus on shifting of burden to poorer countries, real zero emissions have sincere intent. So this is more or less a repetitive point, but that's okay. Now he moves forward to talk about measures to handle global climate change. He's talking about international efforts: Kyoto, COP25, Kigali, Montreal, and then you have CBD. CBD is not directly related to climate change as such, but then it is trying to handle it is trying to control the impact caused by climate change by preserving the biodiversity. And then it's talking about afforestation, biodiversity conservation, and then there is decreasing carbon emissions through carbon neutral and green fuels, renewable energy, and so on. This is basically energy and the power angle. And then awareness among people, this is a social angle in which there is campaigning, there is propaganda, and so on. You sensitize the people towards the problem of climate change. And how do we do it? There are several ways of do it. The government directly tells them, you use celebrities, or they conduct UPSC exams in which I am trying to sensitize you towards the problem of climate change. So it's all an ongoing process. Okay, so this is the age of Anthropocene, where the climate change is driving species to extinction. This is a good point. Anthropocene. A cooperative effort is needed to handle the issue for a better future. So this is a decent conclusion with a good number of points. Okay, this seems to be fine. The answer has been addressed well, but it would have been nice if we talked more about these points. So what I want you all to do is to mention these, elaborate on these efforts, and talk about international efforts that are being taken, talk about national efforts that are being taken, talk about subnational efforts that are being taken. Is there a state in India which is doing really good things in terms of climate change? I want you all to talk about them. And then you also talk about the civil society. What is it doing? Is there any participation in climate change problem, like Greta Thunberg and so on? There are several other civil society organizations. So I want you to hit this question of handling climate change through several angles, not just the international angle and the several agreements that are there. That is one way of handling the answer, but we try to write an answer which has as many diverse points as possible, because that is going to increase the diversity and richness of your answer and eventually increase the marks. So that should be the discussion for the day. I'll see you all tomorrow with a new question. Thank you for the participation. Bye.